we're moving on to Hamdi Ado. She's an associate program specialist at UNESCO, where she supports UNESCO's work on PVE on an institutional and global level. She's been working in the field of international human rights law in education for 10 years, spanning civil society organizations, trade unions, and intergovernmental organizations. So please, Hamdi, go ahead.
Thank you, Alexandra. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all, depending on where you're joining from. So I will also be sharing a short presentation with you all, and I will be sharing my screen right now. Hopefully you can all see my presentation clearly. Excellent. So first and foremost, on behalf of UNESCO, I would like to thank the Counter Extremism Project for bringing us all together for a moment of reflection, with a view for us to share knowledge, but also to learn from each other and learn from these range of experiences. For my presentation, I will be focusing on the power of soft power, in other words, the power of prevention efforts. As you may know, UNESCO is the leading UN agency on education, science, culture, communication, and information, dedicated to building peace in the minds of women and men. And as such, we give particular attention to the promotion of an interdisciplinary and interagency approach to the prevention of violent extremism. In tackling violent extremism, UNESCO's position is very clear. No one is born a violent extremist. Violent extremists are made and they are fueled. Young women and men are learning to hate, and we must teach them, among other things, tolerance, respect, dialogue. And because we know that hard power is not enough to counter a threat fueled by exclusionary rhetoric, manipulated interpretations of faith underpinned by hatred and ignorance. This is why UNESCO adopts this multi-sectorial approach, encompassing youth, empowerment, education, culture, intercultural dialogue, communication, information, and sharing of natural resources. We adopt this preventative approach that goes beyond security aspects, and we ensure that young people are at the heart of our efforts to address some of the pull and push factors that are a reality in their lives. So how do we exactly do this? We do this through, like I mentioned earlier, our intersectorial approach. We start with the premise that it's not enough to counter violent extremism, that we need to prevent it. And this calls for what we call soft power that contributes to a whole of society approach. For instance, through our education work, we rely on education, both formal and informal, as a form or tool to build the resilience within learners against violent extremism and strengthen their commitment to nonviolence and peace. In this regard, we are the UN agency leading on target 4.7 of Sustainable Development Goal 4 through global citizenship education and human rights and peace educational programs. We're able to contribute towards this work of preventing violent extremism through education. For our communication and information sector, for instance, we are able to train media professionals and journalists to provide reliable coverage on terrorism, as well as enhance digital skills for everyone through media and information literacy, foster social inclusion, both on and offline. Through our culture sector, we're able to combat the illicit trafficking of cultural goods and counter the financing of terrorism, as well as protect wild heritage and rebuild communities. And this is best illustrated through a flagship initiative, Reviving the Spirit of Mosul in Iraq, and I will go into some detail later on. Through our social and human sciences sector, we're able to empower young people. Because for us, we see youth as an important partner, as protagonists of change, and we want to invest in building youth resilience with youth, by youth, and for youth, as well as fostering intercultural dialogue. In this regard, it's worthwhile highlighting our Youth Waging Peace project, led by UNESCO's Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development, based in New Delhi, India, and our recent concluded project with our partners UNOCT on youth preventing violent extremism in the MENA region. For our natural sciences, we're able to strive towards building more inclusive sciences and promote the sharing of natural resources. And this is best demonstrated by our work in the Lake Chad region. Lastly, but most importantly, there are two key aspects that are underpinning all of our prevention efforts. And that is one, a gender transformative approach to preventing violent extremism, and two, a human rights-based approach to preventing violent extremism. With regard to our gender approach, we will soon be launching a gender checklist tool that has been developed for practitioners in the field on education programming to address the gender dimension of violent extremism, with a view for us to really look at some of these nuances and tackle issues such as masculinities, going beyond just the notion of toxic masculinities. Now, I just want to touch very quickly on a brief case study for us to really look at how UNESCO, puts into practice this holistic type of approach of using its soft power and using all its sectors and competencies. Here we have some images from our work on Reviving the Spirit of Mosul project. There we are trying to address the issue of violent extremism through really three main axes: through heritage, education, and cultural life. This initiative really seeks to empower the local community as agents of change involved in the process of rebuilding their city through these axes. Through strengthening of the educational system and providing quality education for all, UNESCO is rebuilding schools that have been damaged, assuring gender equality and access to education, and developing curricula and educational capacity in order to tackle the socio-psychological impacts of the devastation that has been left behind, both on the young people, but also their teachers and educators. In the field of culture, UNESCO is restoring the damages inflicted upon the Al-Nouri Mosque, as well as two churches, Al-Sa'a and Al-Tahar in the Old City, in order to safeguard Mosul's multi-faith identity, including through the safeguarding of manuscripts saved from the ISIL destruction in Mosul. This initiative places youth and local communities at the center of reconstruction strategies through capacity building and employment of generating initiatives and activities for employment for young people, as well as through the reconstruction of landmark cultural heritage sites and the reintegration or regeneration of cultural life into the old city of Mosul. And finally, I would like to touch on some lessons learned from some of our work, particularly focusing in on our work on the prevention of violent extremism through education, really looking at what is it that education, what kind of responses can we provide in this area, and what works, what doesn't work, and what are some issues that we need to keep in mind and really consider when going forward in these kind of interventions. So first and foremost, as you know very well, education cannot prevent an individual from committing a violent act in the name of a violent extremist group. However, the provision of relevant and high quality education can help create the conditions that make it difficult for violent extremist ideologies and acts to proliferate. For UNESCO, this educational approach is best promoted through our Global Citizenship Education Program, or what we call GCD, which is really about instilling notions of respect for human rights, social justice, gender equality, environmental sustainability, which are fundamental values that help raise the defenses of peace against violent extremism. Second, it's important to note that the role of education is not to intercept violent extremists or identify individuals who may be potentially violent extremists, but it's about creating the conditions that build the defenses within learners against violent extremism, strengthen their commitment to nonviolence and peace. Therefore, UNESCO's action to prevent violent extremism through education seeks to strengthen the capacities of national education systems through policies, teacher training, educational content, to appropriately and effectively respond. More specifically, educational policies can ensure that places of learning do not become a breeding ground for violent extremism. And finally, and I think this is really important, and this is an area as well that we are further exploring and really investing in more research is looking at the impact of these educational interventions. We have seen some research done by the Council of Europe looking at this idea of students being treated as suspects in the school. And so what are some of the key considerations we need to keep in mind in this area, particularly when you're trying to intervene through the educational sector? One really would be, we need to ensure that we safeguard the rights of the child and their safety. And we must ensure that this is preserved in accordance with international human rights law, and in particularly with regard to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's also important that schools should remain safe, pluralistic learning spaces, and prevention work through schools is incompatible with the securitization of the education sector. And this is, again, going back to this idea of looking at students as suspects rather than looking at them as the learners and children that they are and providing them with the support that they need. Another factor to really consider here and lessons learned is that factors and signs of support for violent extremism differ according to social, political, and cultural context, and that there is no single pathway to violent extremism. Therefore, using profiling tools is not supported by evidence and can in fact be harmful. So what can schools do? Schools who are seeking to have interventions and want to be able to contribute to this effort through the education system could look at how can we better protect learners from harmful and hateful ideologies that condone violent extremism, rather than looking at them as suspects, really looking at how we can promote a sense of inclusion, human rights, well-being, addressing underlying issues such as mental health, safety, gender issues in schools, prevention of school-based violence, bullying, and discrimination. And finally, I really want to highlight that preventing the spread of violent extremist ideologies and protecting learners from risks of recruitment into violent groups or gangs requires a whole of a society or community approach. So we know that, of course, what we can do through the education system, while it's important, it can also be limiting. Children and young people are exposed to more than their school environment. And so while we can nurture and create a safe school environment, we also need to work with parents and families and the broader communities to ensure a safe and inclusive environment for all. In this regard, we'll soon be publishing an advocacy paper that will be looking exactly at this issue. How can we deal with building peace and these notions within learners, within young people, through a human rights lens and through a well-being approach when it comes to the prevention efforts of violent extremism in schools. I thank you.
Well, thank you, Hamdi. This was very insightful and helpful as well. I think a focus on education and on so-called soft power in some countries in the world is still not appreciated enough. Even in the European Union, there was a transformation, I would say, when the former commissioner, Julian King, the commissioner for the Security Union of the European Union, mentioned that soft approaches can lead to hard results. And he was coming from a more of a counterterrorism background, acknowledging while working with Iran and others how important the PVE component can be in the long run, especially in terms of not stigmatizing communities and individuals, as you highlighted perfectly, and pushing them in a role they might not even be in. So with good intentions is not enough. We have to be very careful, and prevention work is an essential part of that. So thank you very much for highlighting this. Now, our final speaker, and I hope we will have a couple of minutes for the great questions that are already been posed. Our final speaker is Anna Izar. She's a program management officer with the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism, where she leads the implementation of a number of programs and thematic portfolios under the umbrella of the Global Program on the Prevention and Countering of Violent Extremism. Anna has worked in the areas related to counterterrorism and prevention of violent extremism in the United Nations for over 10 years in the Middle East, North Africa, West Africa, and South Asia. So Anna also can bring a very broad perspective to the table. Anna, you have the floor. Thank you. You're still on mute.
Yes, I just realized. Thank you very much, Alexander, and thank you very much to all the speakers. I think I'm hoping that I can share my presentation here, so I will just do that right now. Let me see if I can just... You cannot see it right now, right?
Not yet,
My
no.
colleague Marco can share the presentation. He has the slides. So just remind him when you want to change slides.
Okay, great. So just let me know when the presentation is on, and okay, fantastic. Okay. That is great. Thank you so much. So I would like to first start by thanking everyone here, thanking you for the invitation and thanking the speakers who provided the perfect framing for what I'm going to speak about right now. So to give some more context to a lot that has already been said and many of the best practices that have been shared with us, I'm going to focus on the normative framework that has given context to many of these best practices from the point of view of the UN. So the presentation will focus on what constitutes international best practice and where this came from. And that is basically what takes us to the United Nations Plan of Action on Preventing Violent Extremism. Then I will move on to some of our tools, such as UNOCT's reference guide, which has worked to try and articulate and encapsulate some of these recommendations and best practices. And I will end up by zooming into what the global program on PCVE aims to do and how it was conceived. And then we'll present one of our case studies that represents in the best possible way an articulation and an integration of several interventions across portfolios and thematic areas, which is Sudan. So next slide, please. So as many of you will know, the United Nations Plan of Action to Prevent Violent Extremism was actually became one of the main normative documents to guide the United Nations efforts in the prevention of violent extremism in 2016. So just to give a bit of a historical context, this happened after Daesh or ISIL had raided Iraq and Syria, and the focus was on how can we actually move to a point where we recognize a more profound level the need to prevent violent extremism. The action plan and the fact that it became a United Nations document put forth by the Secretary General and providing recommendations for member states paved the way for a few other documents to be developed. One of these is the UNOCT reference guide on plans of action to prevent and counter violent extremism. And this in turn ended up with the creation within UNOCT and within the United Nations Center on Counterterrorism, with the creation of the global PCVE program, which aimed to encapsulate most of these best practice and most of what had already been recognized and determined to have a work based on evidence, and to bring all of this together as an example of international good practice. Next slide, please. So the PVE plan of action has many different pillars to it. So these pillars basically talk about what good practice would be. Many of them as you can see on the screen, focus on activities, and some others focus on intervention, some others focus on who we should bring to the table. So the overarching topics here are being inclusive, being consultative, being able to promote and to address what were considered the conditions that were conducive to violent extremism and terrorism, that is the root causes, and to be able to engage with those communities that were affected by it, to take their views and their suggestions into consideration when developing interventions. So at the root of this was also the recognition and the evidence proof that there were fundamental issues that were not being addressed and that basically became the root cause of radicalization and violent extremism in some contexts. One of these is, for example, human rights, the need to uphold human rights and help member states implement their international obligations in respect to human rights, was seen as one of the fundamental conditions to try and prevent the phenomenon of violent extremism and radicalization, as well as observing the rule of law and making sure that law enforcement responses and interventions were in line with human rights as well, and were commensurate and were always informed by evidence instead of bias or stereotypes. So the 7 areas, which then you will see that the global program integrated into its development, are conflict prevention as a good step to try and mitigate the context that give rise to violent extremism, good governance, which is what I just spoke about, observing human rights and making sure that law enforcement is done as well in observing states' obligations under international human rights law, engaging communities, and in this case, we have worked extensively with women's groups, with youth groups, with civil society groups, in places where it may not be the easiest to engage them because there is also a lack of trust, which takes me to trust building as another one of those good practices that have been identified as crucial. Empowering youth, that means giving them the tools and the space, a safe space, but also the tools to counter and prevent extremism within their own communities. And this is important. I am going to address this later, but this is important because for us, UNOCT, as a headquarters-based entity, we need to work through partners on the ground to be able to have any impact, not to mention sustainable and long-lasting impact. So one of the best ways that we have found to work with our beneficiaries, interlocutors, partners, and stakeholders is to actually empower them to do themselves or conduct the interventions, be the ones that are leading, be the ones that youth, for example, are empowering their peers so that they can carry on everything that they have learned through coaching, mentoring, and capacity development, and can move away and keep perpetuating this as in a ripple effect.
I apologize for interrupting, and it's very unfair because you are the final speaker. And since everybody before was a bit generous with their time, we're officially ending in 2 minutes, but I'm just saying that so nobody feels bad who has commitments right at 5 o'clock now in my timeline, let's say in 2 minutes. So whoever has to leave in 2 minutes, Please don't feel bad, but we will continue, of course. So you can finish your presentation, and we will then see who is still around to maybe even address some of the questions. But of course, everyone who has follow-up commitments is totally free to leave in a minute or so. Thank you so much, and sorry again, Anna, for the interruption. Please go ahead.
It's okay, I'll rush through it. So next slide, please. So this is the reference guide. It codifies good practices, as you can see. And I can give you, if anyone is interested, I'm happily sharing the link so that I don't go into it. One of the recommendations from the PVE Plan of Action of the Secretary General was to develop national and regional action plans that member states could use to prevent violent extremism. Next slide, please. So this is the global program on preventing and countering violent extremism. It has these 6 portfolios that focus on education. We work very closely with UNESCO, so I was very happy that Hamdi went into detail about this. Mental health youth policy assistance, which aims to support member states that want to develop national action plans on prevention of violent extremism. New frontiers, these recognize that there is an emergence of issues such as climate change and video games that could have an intersection with violent extremism, and strategic communication, something that helps counter hateful narratives and helps create more positive perceptions of issues that may lead to grievances. All of these, of course, through the lens of human rights and gender, which are mainstream throughout these interventions. Next slide, please. So the Sudan case study, I will go through it as well very, very quickly because obviously I have no more time left. So we work with Sudanese counterparts when the situation was still conducive for this, to do some of what I spoke about before, empower young people and give them the tools to be the ones that led the creation of safe spaces so that other youth people could come to them and learn the tools that they could use to help them prevent and countering violent extremism, hateful narratives, radicalization trends, and that they could somehow put a spin on that and a more positive lens. At the end of the day, with all of these events that we concluded and with the lessons that we learned, our thinking has been, if we really want to lead transformational change, if we want to move away from altering behavior and conducting interventions that will have a very limited impact in time and also in results, as in like interventions that perhaps will work for the short term or in the mid-term, but that are not going to be leading to anything sustainable or anything that can actually give the impact that we're looking at seeing 10 years down the lane, we should move away from trying to compartmentalize the interventions that we're having, which is why we integrated different thematic areas within this global PCVE program, and try to work with the partners that we have on the ground that already have the experience and have been doing it for many years, such as UNESCO, such as UNDP, such as UNFPA, depending on the specific topic that we're talking about, and trying to do it as well in a way in which we transfer the leadership to the community so that they really own this kind of activity or intervention, that they are convinced, that they understand why this is something that will be of benefit to them, and that we have the time to build that trust so that as external actors, our voices are legitimate, but legitimate just to empower the community themselves to carry on this work. This transformational change doesn't happen after a 3-year global program. They don't happen after 5 years. This is something that leads to generational change. And I'm very happy that Hamdi touched upon education and touched upon curricula and global citizenship. This is actually what we would like to be looking at. How do we start a trend in which everything that we have done and everything that we are doing actually leads us to this transformational change, where we won't be having to target violent extremism as a phenomenon, because we have populations that have already embedded resilience since very early on. So with this, I will conclude. I don't want to take more of your time, and thank you very much.